Okay, the reading for this week is the next part in our series on Chinese civilization and culture and philosophy. It's selections from the Mengzi, or the Mencius, on human nature. Okay, as we've discussed in previous videos, human nature or nature in general, the nature of something is the kanji sei teki no sei. Qing is the Chinese pronunciation, so this is about on human Qing, or nature. And Mengzi, of course, is one of the great classical Confucian scholars, lived approximately 100 years after Confucius. Mengzi, and as commentators often note, Confucius has the Latin ending, ius at the end of the name, when we render it in English or in other European languages, Latin-based languages. Mencius also has the ius at the end. And the reason is when the Jesuits went to China and discovered these writers, they encountered the books that were put together and canonized by Zhou, namely the 4 books, right? And 2 of the 4 books are the Mengzi, the Mencius, and the Kongzi, or the Lunyu by Kongzi. So these writers they were exposed to initially, but they were not exposed to other writers such as other equally important early Confucian writers such as Shunzi, who was very important, but the Jesuits were not exposed to him when they first encountered Confucian writing, so he didn't get the ius at the end of his name. So whenever you see the ius at the end of a name, it means the Jesuits found them and began writing about them and were exposed to them from early on. Okay, selections from the Mencius on human nature. Mengzi, or Mencius, was a particularly powerful advocate for the thought of Confucius. Living in the 4th century BC, about 100 years after Confucius, Mencius too was concerned about the contradiction between the ideal of a peaceful, unified hierarchical feudal kingdom and the reality of nearly constant warfare between de facto independent feudal states in which the large and powerful preyed upon and absorbed the smaller and weaker states. So like Confucius, Mencius lived in the latter days of the Warring States period, which is the end of the Zhou dynasty, the long many centuries spanning Zhou dynasty, which devolved into chaos and war, and Mencius, along with Confucius and Lao Tzu as well, lived through this period, and eventually the Qing state, which was one of the 8 or 9 warring states, eventually gobbled up all of the other states and unified China into the Qing dynasty in the 3rd century BC. But Mengzi lives right in the period just before that. Like Confucius, Mencius offered his services to feudal lords. Also like Confucius, Mencius had a more successful career as a teacher than as an official. Okay, so Confucius and Mencius both went around the various states and warring states looking for kings who would hire them to serve as a instructor, as a teacher, as a ethical teacher and so forth, but they had very little success doing this. Hold on. Right. Not as a teacher, I'm sorry, as an official. Mencius and Confucius both went around the various states looking for work as an official, as a bureaucrat, but nobody would hire them, so they eventually made their way as a teacher and got by as working as teachers, and obviously are remembered today as teachers and philosophers. Okay. Selections from the Mengzi on human nature. Okay, as always, there are 2 sections here, the short version and the longer version. I'm going to read the longer version of this excerpt from the Mengzi. And as always, the full, the essay, not the entire Mengzi, but the excerpt from the essay can be found in William Theodore de Barry and Irene Bloom's Sources of Chinese Tradition, 1999, Columbia University Press. Okay. Before I read the excerpt, I'm going to read the study questions that we'll discuss in class. Question 1. What assumptions does Mencius make about human nature, about Qing? Question 2. How does Mencius's thinking in regard to human nature fit with your conceptions of human nature? Okay. And question 3. How does Mencius' thinking on human nature compare to that of Xunzi? And Xunzi, of course, is the philosopher who came after Mencius, who famously said that 人轻智恶, right? Human nature is rotten, or human nature is bad or evil. That's how that's often translated. All right, so Mencius and Xunzi have very different ideas about human nature. Explain them, discuss that difference, and why they arrive at their different conclusions. Question number 4: What implications does Mencius' thinking on human nature have for his advice on how to govern a state? Right. So your political philosophy of one's political philosophy rises out of, or is grounded in, one's idea about the nature of the human soul, right? If you think that humans are evil and bad, then you'll come up with a certain philosophy about how government should be established, right? So, for example, Han Feize has a very different understanding of human nature coming out of the Xunzi school of philosophy, and he constructs a political philosophy that is very different from the political philosophies that are grounded in Mencius' more optimistic view of human nature. All right, here's the essay now. Selections from the Mengzi on human nature, book or section 2A6, passage 6 from 2A. All human beings have a mind that cannot bear to see the suffering of others. Right, so you have the famous incident of the well, the child that's about to fall into a well, and this excerpt includes that episode. The ancient kings, so the ancient kings of Zhou, had a commiserating mind, so an empathetic mind, we might say today, a sympathetic mind, a commiserating mind, and accordingly a commiserating government. Although I don't like the word empathy, I shouldn't say that. A sympathetic or compassionate mind. A commiserating government. Having a commiserating mind, a commiserating government, the world was like turning something around on the palm of the hand. Here is why I say that all human beings have a mind that commiserates with others. Now, there's a note here about the now. At the beginning of the passage, Mencius recalls that the ancient kings had this, quote, mind that cannot bear to see the suffering of others. Here he affirms that people of the present also have it. Okay, so this is a point that Han Feize makes too. He says that, people might have been good in the past and might have been able to possess Ren and show sympathy and compassion towards other human beings, but they are not like it now. They're not like that now, is what Han Feize says. But Mencius, Mengzi, is saying that they are, in fact, the same today as they were in that idyllic past of the Zhou sage kings. Now, if anyone were suddenly to see a child about to fall into a well, so back in the days of the Zhou dynasty, early Zhou dynasty, it was true. It's also true now. If somebody were to see a child about to fall into a well, his mind would always be filled with alarm, distress, pity, and compassion. That he would react accordingly is not because he would use the opportunity to ingratiate himself with the child's parents, so this isn't about external rewards, nor because he would seek commendation from neighbors and friends, nor because he would hate the adverse reputation. From this it may be seen that one who lacks a mind that feels pity and compassion would not be human. Right, so it's pity and compassion that makes one human. One who lacks a mind that feels shame and aversion would not be human. One who lacks a mind that feels modesty and compliance would not be human. So shame and aversion are what make us human. Modesty and compliance are what make us human. Pity and compassion are what make us human. And one who lacks a mind that knows right and wrong, would not be human. These are the things that make us human. They're with us, inside of us from the beginning. So this is an internalist perspective about human nature and about ethics. The mind's feeling of pity and compassion is the beginning of Ren, humaneness. The mind's feeling of shame and aversion is the beginning of rightness, Yi. The mind's feeling of modesty and compliance is the beginning of propriety, or ritual, right? This sense of propriety, etiquette, li, which is also a li, but a different kanji than principle, li. And the mind's sense of right and wrong, yi, is the beginning of wisdom, or zhi. Human beings have these four beginnings just as they have four limbs. This is his famous sort of analogy of the four limbs. The four beginnings correspond to the four limbs. For one to have these four beginnings and yet to say of oneself that one is unable to fulfill them is to injure one's ruler. When we know how to enlarge and bring to fulfillment these four beginnings that are within us, it will be like a fire beginning to burn or a spring finding an outlet. If one is able to bring them to fulfillment, they will be sufficient to enable him to protect all within the four seas. If one is not, they will be insufficient even to enable him to serve his parents. Okay, a fire beginning to burn, or a spring beginning to find an outlet, or a spring finding an outlet. Whenever you see a metaphor, or a simile, or some kind of parable, or figurative language that appears in early Confucian writings, underline it, because it usually appears several times throughout the work, and its metaphors are often more important than sort of simple, straightforward, descriptive language. Okay, that's all for now on this passage from the Mengzi, dealing with Mencius's, Mengzi's very famous and optimistic notion about the goodness of human nature, or Qing. All right, that's all for now. We'll discuss more in class. Goodbye.